For many years, starting probably in 2014, the people across the country and in Kansas who didn't like the idea of reducing taxes started pointing to Kansas as kind of their proof that taxes couldn't be cut. But at the same time that was happening, states like North Carolina, Indiana, and Tennessee all successfully cut taxes. So the real issue for us was what was different about Kansas. And while some of the things that were said about this Kansas experience weren't accurate, or in some cases not flat out not true, Kansas did have an awful lot of serious budget challenges, and most of that was avoidable. There were some mistakes made, and there were also a number of other extenuating circumstances that weren't directly related to the tax change, including a really toxic political environment. So we decided we wanted to tell this story so that legislators and policymakers all across the country could understand what really happened and help inform their efforts to reduce taxes. So with the partnership with the Heartland Institute, we actually sent a free copy of this book because we knew nobody was really going to buy it. Come on, it's not going to make the top 10 list. But we sent a free copy of the book to every legislator in the country. There's about 8,000 state legislators received a copy of this so they could all understand what really happened in Kansas. As I said, there were a lot of mistakes made. The three big ones were don't cut taxes and increase spending. Number two, have good plans in place. And number three, actually have a plan. I got those backwards. Actually have a plan to balance the budget. Those things didn't exist. Let's start with the spending issue. The narrative around the country was that spending had been cut, dramatically cut, and that wasn't true. As you can see here, spending went up almost every year. There was 1 year in 2016 where it didn't increase, but that was basically an accounting gimmick because the legislature didn't make all the KPERS pension payments when they should. Otherwise, we would have seen, in other words, if they had accrual accounting like business, spending would have gone up every year. But spending, now some of the agency spending, some of the budgets were cut back a little bit, but total spending for the state continued to rise all the while we had taxes reduced. This slide shows you that general fund spending, and this kind of puts the whole history in perspective where you can see that there was we're now 1.7, is it 1.7? Yeah, $1.7 billion over long-term inflation. We go back to, so in other words, if state spending had been increased since 1995 just for the rate of inflation, we'd be spending $1.7 billion less right now. The same thing is true of the all funds budget. There we go. All funds, general fund, most people hear about the general fund, and that's just one of many, many funds. The general fund is part of the all funds. That's counting it all, adding it all up. That budget is running $5.2 billion ahead of long-term inflation. That's a lot of money that we're spending above inflation over time. General fund tax revenue, also running long-term ahead of inflation. And you can see even when there was the reduction there in starting in 2014, this is fiscal year data, so there's fiscal year difference between some of the tax years. But you can see where it came down. It was still about $900 million ahead of long-term inflation. So we still had very high tax increases, and that's why one of the reasons that Kansas is by no means a low-tax state. When this whole process got started, we had a lot of conservatives in the legislature and out come to us and say, look, we love this idea. We really need to reduce taxes in Kansas, but how are we going to run government on less money? And so we went out and looked at the taxing and spending plans of all 50 states, and what we came back with was this kind of response. It's the spending. The only thing that determines how much any government taxes is how much it chooses to spend. They all, for example, every state has education and highways and social services and so forth. But the states that tax income, the states that tax income spend 50% more per resident providing those same services as the states without an income tax. I mean, 50%. We also looked at the states with the highest and lowest combined state and local tax burden because there was some concern that, well, maybe those states have lower state taxes because they push spending off to local government. There it was 45% more per resident by the states with the highest state and local tax burden. Kansas, as you can see, is 36% higher per resident than the states without an income tax. And that's why from the time the plan was passed, we knew from our research that what government had to do was basically go from being morbidly inefficient to grossly inefficient to balance the budget. We didn't have to get anywhere close to the way that the really efficient states operate. We just had to get a little bit better. Unfortunately, we didn't. That research also showed that it wasn't just that the states that spend less tax less, they also grow more. And again, same comparisons looking at, and this just focuses on the states that tax income versus those that don't. GDP from 1998 to 2016 grew 129% in the states without an income tax, 100% in the other states, and only 90% in Kansas. Same kind of relationship with the job growth. Private sector job growth up 40% in the states without an income tax, 21% in the states with an income tax, and only 12% in Kansas. So very remarkable differences in the economic performance of these states. No plan to balance the budget. This was one of the folks working on the inside knew this, but it was something that I think the general public wasn't aware of. There was never any plan. The governor's first plan that he introduced would have just reduced taxes by $350 million over 5 years. So $70 million roughly a year with a $6 billion budget. It wasn't a really big cut. But even at that, there was no plan of, if this is implemented, here are the exact steps we'll take to balance the budget. The plan went to the House of Representatives, and by the time it left there, it was over $1 billion in reduction, and then the Senate took it to $3.5 billion. There was a lot of political gamesmanship going on there that we talk about in the book, explaining how and why that took place and the assumptions that people made. But the important thing was, at no point during that time was there ever a plan in place to balance the budget. And that's important, not just from making it work, but it's also part of how you help people understand, how you help legislators understand this is how it's going to work, how you explain to citizens that this is what we're going to do. Because if you ask people, in fact, the surveys all show, everybody wants government at all levels to operate more efficiently. If you explain, look, this is what we're going to do, we're not going to cut the services, we're going to reduce the cost of services, there's a lot of buy-in. And then if you follow that with, and here's how we're going to do it, now I can see a roadmap. None of that ever took place in Kansas. Having the right systems in place. So two of the big systems that Kansas, one they didn't have in place, a budget system. There's an appropriations process where every year agencies come in and ask for more money, and legislators try to figure out how to allocate the money. But there's never been a real, honest-to-goodness budget process in Kansas. It's being implemented now. Many states and even local governments have either a performance-based budget, which is what Kansas is working through now, or some call it a priority-based budget, others call it a zero-based budget. Basically what it does is look at every function and program that that agency does, and they start with a mission statement. What is this program? What is the agency supposed to do? What is the purpose of this program? How do we measure its success? What is the cost per unit of output? So you can compare across agencies and even compare to other states to see how you're doing. And really look not just at what you're spending, but what you're accomplishing, because that's the purpose. It's not just to spend money, it's to get something done, provide some specific service. Kansas is in the process of doing that. Without something like this, the system really isn't designed for legislators to really see how the money is spent. No matter how hard they try, it's really difficult to get it. The other system is having a reliable method of estimating revenue. Kansas does have one, but it's not, over time, it's not been all that reliable. There was a lot of news stories about how Kansas was missing revenue estimates during the 2014 to 2016 years. Ironically, the misses were not as great as they were in the 10 years prior to the tax cuts going into effect. We documented all that. You just didn't hear about it in the media. But it was actually a little more accurate, as inaccurate as it was. It's always been inaccurate. And there's a lot of ways that it could be fixed. Revenue Secretary Williams actually proposed a number of fixes. They've been able to do some things that they can do on their own, but some of it needs legislative approval, and those recommendations haven't even gotten out of committee. That's something else that really needs to be addressed. Some big myths we exposed. First of all, that giant tax plan, that $3.5 billion plan, most of it wasn't ever implemented, because in 2013, they raised some of the income tax. They took back some of the tax cuts by changing the deductions. And then in 2015, they raised the state sales tax rate. So according to legislative research calculations, only about 53% of the total tax cuts actually were implemented. The net tax cut was much lower than what was actually passed in 2012. The other myth dealt with the tax avoidance. I'll back up here a second. There were two main elements to the tax plan. One was reducing marginal rates, where the top rate went from 6.45 to 4.9%. That was about 70% of the tax reductions. The other part, the other 30%, was the exemption on small business income, where it was the shorthand was the LLC exemption. That's pass-through income, which means companies like partnerships and proprietorships, LLCs, which are generally partnerships, the income from those companies flows through to the individual owner, the partner or the proprietor, and they pay the tax on their personal income tax. So that income was exempt. When the Department of Revenue was giving their estimates on what that might cost, they said there were 190,000 taxpayers claiming the exemption. And then after the first year it was in effect, it turned out there were 330,000 people claiming the exemption. And so naturally that led to rampant speculation that there was a lot of tax avoidance. It turns out the 190,000 was a mistake. The IRS data that they were using very clearly showed every year that there were about 330,000 people claiming the exemption. The issue was, we think, those exemptions are claimed on 3 federal schedules, Schedule C, E, and F, and there were 190,000 on Schedule C. But if you counted Schedule C, E, and F, there were 330,000. Now there's, I think, 339,000. So it went up. It's gone up a little bit over time, but again, there wasn't much of that. Internal Department of Revenue tracking of big companies, the C corporations changing their status, showed there was less than 2% of those companies that changed, and there's always been a little bit of that change. There was also an independent academic study that attributed less than 2% of the revenue loss to tax avoidance. So there was a little bit, but that wasn't what was causing the budget problem. The toxic political environment. You know, Kansas is thought of as a very conservative state. A lot of Republicans here. But when Governor Brownback was elected in 2010, there were a lot of media stories about he maybe being the first conservative governor Kansas had had in about 50 years. And there were a lot of people who were not pleased with that, and the plans were put in place from that day forward to make sure it never happened again. And one of the ways that manifested itself was with this tax plan. Because, like it or not, every legislator has an obligation to balance the budget some way. But for years, Democrats and many Republicans wouldn't entertain either a tax increase to balance the budget structurally or any way of reducing the cost of government. There was this kind of burn it down mentality that developed. It was as though they'd rather see the state and tax cuts in general burned to the ground so that it would never happen again. And it was being watched all across the country, because if it worked in Kansas, there was going to be a wave of these kind of massive tax cuts. And so that couldn't be allowed to happen. Here's another example of how that toxic political environment impacted it. That LLC exemption, that very toxic, has to go away, it's unfair, and so forth, came up for a vote in 2016 in the House of Representatives. It failed by 19 votes. Fell 19 votes short of being put back in place, with 24 Republicans and Democrats voting against it. People who had been saying for years, we need to repeal this. Given the opportunity, they wouldn't do it. And finally, as we explain in the book, one of the senators explained the rationale. She told the Cap Journal, well, if we did that, we'd lose all our leverage. because they didn't just want to put that tax back on business. They wanted to put the tax back on not only on every individual, but also what they ultimately did, is, as Eric will explain, is they put some of the poorest people in Kansas back on the tax rolls. And it was, again, 2016 was an election year. So the concern was that if you got the LLC tax back in place, the public might think the thing was fixed. And then there wouldn't be the incentive to vote out some conservatives in the legislature and vote some other people in. So this toxic political environment was going on. There was also a few things that had really nothing to do with tax policy that had serious budget implications. You know, Kansas, most of us here know it's an oil state. Now, most people don't know that it's not like it's Texas and Oklahoma, but oil is a bigger part of our economy than most states. And in 2014, when the really serious budget challenges hit, we also happened to have oil prices plummet from around $100 to eventually, at one point, below $30 a barrel. And Kansas, we all know, is an ag state. And while that's at the same time almost, we had kind of the perfect storm of commodity prices falling. So we not only lost around $200 million in severance tax from the oil, we also had very large sales tax declines, because even though the sales tax rate had gone up in 2015, there were still many counties in Kansas that had that lost sales tax revenue, and those are the counties where oil and ag really overlapped. There's a map in the book that shows that history. So lessons learned: don't cut taxes and increase spending. That's a fourth grade math problem. Have the right systems in place, and ideally make that plan about reducing the cost of government, not cutting the services, but just making government more efficient. Get the right systems in place and be honest. I mean, one of the things Kansas suffered from was a few unfortunate turn of phrases from Governor Brownback, like, this will be a shot of adrenaline. Tax cuts will have a positive effect on an economy, but it doesn't happen overnight. You have to be honest about how long this is going to take. You also have to be honest about what happens if we don't do some of these things. So that's kind of a very quick synopsis of the book. There's a copy in the back if you'd like, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
So please raise your hand if you have a question, and we will get you a microphone, and not everybody at once.
One behind you, James.
What would have been a couple of the lowest hanging fruit cost reduction opportunities that Brownback should have put in place?
You know, there were, and it wasn't just Brownback, it was the legislature. Because, a governor can certainly lead and should. A governor should be using the bully pulpit regardless of which way they go on any kind of policy. But it also requires a lot of legislative will. There were a number of things. There was the Blackstone Group, I think it was called, back in 2011, I still have a copy of it. It's about that thick of opportunities to reduce costs. And, there's not a lot of, Mitch Daniels, former governor of Indiana, kind of put this in perspective. He said, and he was talking about Purdue University, he said, government is inefficient, but you can't go in and just whack a big piece of fat off somewhere. It's kind of like a cow. It's marbled throughout the enterprise. And so that's why these efficiency studies are really thick, and you're not going to go get it tens of millions at a time in most cases. It's going to come in smaller pieces, but there's hundreds of those smaller pieces. And some of them were implemented. There were some things that the administration could do that didn't require legislative support. But the big ones that required legislative support, they just couldn't get. Like, for example, there were some opportunities to save money on pension costs. There were opportunities to save money on purchasing. There were examples in the Alvarez and Marcel study showing very large, now this would be a one-time savings, but we're talking this one in the hundreds of millions on cash reserves. And there just wasn't the legislative will in some cases to even have a hearing on whether some of those things should be done. And some of that is, but I could go on, but I'll just stop there. So,
thank you, David Babish. You mentioned that the LLCs went from 190,000 to 330,000. That's not an insignificant number. Can you elaborate on how that could possibly happen?
Sure. It was a mistake. they never should have, it didn't go from 190 to 330. It was estimated at the beginning that there were only 190,000, but the IRS data very clearly shows that there were 330,000 all along. So there really wasn't any change. IRS tracks all those different. It was just an estimate. What may have happened, and this is kind of the way, I mean, I've seen honest mistakes like this happen in our shop. Somebody says, how many business entities are there? Business entities. Okay, I'll go to Schedule C. There's 190,000, and somehow that number gets put out. The question should have been, how many people are claiming it? Or maybe the question was asked that way, and they only got the answer from one Schedule C. We don't know. But there was no significant increase. It was just a mistake on the original estimate.
So we don't know who's responsible for that 190K number?
No, it came out of probably out of the Revenue Department and Legislative Research, and there was probably a lot of people, including us. We should have gone and looked later to see. Excuse me?
They still have a job?
I don't. Again, we don't know who it was, but it was an unfortunate mistake, but there really wasn't any kind of significant tax avoidance.
Dave, right over here.
Yes, sir, thanks for being here. It said to have the right systems in place, and it said that the legislature cannot see how the tax dollars are being spent.
Not really.
How did we get so dumb?
That's actually a pretty common, unfortunately, the question was, I don't think his mic was working, it was, he said, you said the legislature can't see how the money is spent. How did we get so dumb? Unfortunately, that's a pretty common occurrence across all forms of government in this country. The way the process works, including up to now, the performance-based budget system is just being implemented now. All legislators get is, here's how much this agency spent or was budgeted to spend last year. I mean, the budget books can be very thick, but it doesn't get into, one of the things most government budgeting doesn't look at is what was actually spent. They look at what was budgeted to be spent. So if you didn't spend it all and some of that money is still sitting in a bank account somewhere, legislators don't know that. That's not part of the what's really an appropriations process. That's just the way it is, and that's why having these right systems in place is crucial. Some states around the country have done it for several years. Even some local forms of government have implemented those.
And the department heads will tell you, if we don't spend it this year, we don't get it again next year.
That's the way the thinking goes. Sadly, I don't even know if that's true because
I think it's BS.
Because the process wasn't designed to look at what was actually spent. That's the assumption that the agencies make, and maybe some governments look at actual compared to budget, but in most cases it's just budget to budget.
Okay, next question right here.
Thanks, Dave. Were there expectations about what the LLCs or S Corps and all would do with the savings? I have a small S Corp and had a windfall and I did nothing. I mean, what was that a built-in plan? Was there expectations? Were there any, you do this, you get this, or was it just, we hope you'll do something?
There was no specific plan of, we think if this happens, this many jobs will be created. But here was some of the thinking behind it, which we talk about in the book. One of the things we learned is that Kansas, like every other state, is extraordinarily dependent on jobs from new establishments. Now, a new establishment could be you opening a new restaurant, or it could be Walmart opening a new location. But when we look at the census data that tracks jobs by business cycle, what we find is that if not for jobs created by new establishments, this state would have only had 2 years of private sector job growth since 1977. We're that dependent because the jobs from all other, whether it's a business that's 1 year old or 20 years old, all those other jobs, there were more jobs lost in those business cycles than were created in in the new establishment. So there's this understanding that, and Kansas is actually a little bit better than nationally. Nationally, there would have been no years of private sector job growth if not for creation from new establishments. So there's this real understanding that we're extraordinarily dependent on small business growth. You know, ironically, the incentives tend to chase the big companies, and they don't really produce any more jobs than companies that don't get the incentives. You look, it's understanding what's going to drive the economy. So they knew that the small business was critically important. They hoped that this would be, and they also hoped that it would attract businesses from other states. And it did do that. We saw a dramatic increase of adjusted gross income coming from Missouri into Kansas in the first 2 years after that. So it did do some of that, but I don't think that they actually had a number of what was to be expected.
The Brown administration, excuse me, their CAN-CARE proposal, or that they implemented, is for the privatization of the delivery of healthcare services. Did that actually save any money, or what's your opinion of that as far as having helped the cost curve?
Both administrations have said that the expectation was that it would save about $1 billion over 10 years. I've not seen any analysis that proves those numbers out. There were savings, but the exact amount I couldn't tell you.
The book, based on its title, seems to take a good retrospective look at what went wrong. That also opens up the opportunity to say, how can we do this right going forward? Are you all looking at putting together a blueprint plan, how, when the opportunity arises to take another shot?
Absolutely.
Right?
Okay. Absolutely. We have, Eric is going to talk a little bit about that, but yes, we are working on what can be done. We're going to be diving deeply into the performance-based budget metrics that are coming out. We'll have access to that data very soon, and we'll be able to identify very specific ways that money can be saved and start using that to buy down. There's other things you can do, like you can just use a ratchet method. You can, as revenues come in beyond a certain gain, say 2%, any revenue increase above 2% can be used to buy down next year's rates. That was part of the original plan, so we could go back to that. So yes, there are going to be some very specific recommendations coming out.
Thank you, Dave. I always appreciate your very clear articulation of the facts. I know you're always in the trenches up in Topeka. I have some very clear memories of multiple bills being drafted that were across the board cuts. I saw them printed, I knew they existed, and followed the pathway through leadership and beyond about bringing them to the floor. I wonder if you might articulate or delineate between kind of a blanket assessment of individual legislators and the role leadership plays in bringing those bills to the floor.
Okay, well, that would require probably the rest of the seminar to really answer that, Debbie. But there were a number of bills that were written, but they understand how the budget process works, or I should say appropriation process in Kansas. They work off of the governor's budget. So you can make adjustments to it, but having a budget come out that didn't include a lot of ways to reduce government put the legislature kind of behind the 8 ball to begin with. There were bills prepared that would do across-the-board cuts. And across-the-board cuts, frankly, aren't all that good. The danger is, you've heard the speculation. Well, if you cut spending, that's going to cut service. And that's what government often does. If you leave the bureaucracy in charge, they'll cut the things that don't hurt them. They'll cut the program. Sometimes I've heard some people say, cut this because then we'll get public support. Oh, don't cut the football program. We need to raise taxes. So you don't want to do really across the board, but there were at least some attempts made, as Debbie mentioned, to, but some of those bills didn't see the light of day, or sometimes they don't see the light of day because they know there's not going to be any support for it, so why waste the effort?
I saw one more hand. Is there anybody else who's got one question before we move on? Now we're at Here's our last question.
Dave, is there any states that you would say are good role models as far as on having a good budget system that we could pick off of?
Yeah, there are several states that, and I don't have the list off the top of my head, but I can get those for you, Paul. We work with a good friend of mine, Bob Williams, used to run the State Budget Solutions. They have a lot of recommendations. A number of states that are doing it, have been doing it for several years. Some have been doing it for more than a decade. I'm not familiar with their individual practice. I know they've had the systems in place, but we can get you a list of the states that are good models. And Kansas could turn out to be a good model. We just haven't seen all of it implemented yet.
Thank you very much, Dave.
Thanks.